Hello, and welcome to Film Slam Stream's post-film conversation for Call Me Anytime. I'm not leaving the house. My name is Eric Siler, and I'm an instructor of film, media arts, and communications, as well as moderator for this conversation. We're very pleased to be joined by the director of this film, Sanjna Selva. Sanjna is a filmmaker from New York who began working her career in Sundance and supported the documentary Silent Beauty. You saw her debut film, Call Me Anytime Not Leaving the House, which she directed, produced, shot, and edited about two sisters separated in the Ukrainian war. Sanjna is a graduate of Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and she is presently co-directing and producing her next documentary, which we'll hear a little more about. Hello, Sanjna, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's wonderful to have you, and it's just wonderful for you to expose a documentary in which the story is still being written. That's just so fascinating, and you gave us just such an insight into what living in a war country is like. So, just tell us briefly how you got connected to the project.
Yeah, I got connected through the project at the time, well, last year in February. I was working as a journalist and I was covering a lot of stories in New York and also globally. But the war started, and I had always kind of had an interest in war journalism, but also very much a resistance to how I feel like a lot of public media and just the media that we see depicts war and reporting of war, where you see imagery of violence and imagery of these just tropes that depict war. And I was kind of, as a journalist, very curious about how we can tell stories about the war in which we don't see these imagery and these tropes that we've been told represent violence and represent conflict. And so it kind of came from this artistic sense of wanting to tell a war story. You don't see the war, but you still feel and you still get a sense of what it's like to actually be there in a conflict zone, and how we could do that creatively without subjecting audiences to just these tropes that I think are harmful and degrading sometimes. That I think a lot of journalism, we've moved away from that, but we're still in that place of needing to do that work. And then, I thought that the war in Ukraine was unfolding right before our eyes. I was in New York City with a huge Ukrainian diasporic population. I think the biggest in the US is in New York City. And I was so curious about how people were, especially in the diasporic community, reaching back home, connecting with family back home. What were they saying? What conversations were happening? And so the night the war broke out, I had this idea. I had these questions and this artistic sense, and I had this idea to tell a film entirely through just that. And so the next day I went to the first protest in New York for Ukraine and started speaking to people who were there, who were Ukrainian, about what this experience was like for them. And that's where I met my film protagonist, Lesia, and her daughter, who are both in the film.
Interesting. So, you knew Leisha was going to FaceTime her sister, so she agreed to have you come over and film this whole FaceTime. And I know documentary filmmakers, as you said off camera, you'd like to build a relationship, but this wasn't a relationship you could build. You were just swooping in. So tell us a little bit about that filming experience.
Yeah, it was very jarring because as a documentary filmmaker, as someone who studied ethics and practice of documentary, I feel like it's so important to not do this parachute journalism, parachuting into someone's life, co-opting off of trauma and using that on screen. And so I was wrestling with that the whole time. I was like, that's exactly, what I've been taught to not do. And for this film, it feels like there's no other way. But it really did feel like it because there was such an urgency of the moment to capture this first phone call home. And I'm a documentary filmmaker. I knew we weren't going to reenact anything. We were going to be as truthful to the process as possible, and it needed to be the first phone call. I think something that was important that I discussed very early on when I met Lacia and her daughter. We talked instantly about how this genocide was of Ukrainians by Russia was very much a genocide of culture and language and history. It was an erasure of Ukrainian people, or an attempt at erasure. And I mentioned to them I was a filmmaker and I was interested in filming and making a film about this moment. And we talked about how important it was to have an archive of documenting what Ukrainians were experiencing at this time, and how important it was, how important the role of film was. So once I knew that we had that trust and we had this common vision to create something together, to document a moment in time, that's kind of when I asked her if she would be willing. And she had mentioned that she was about to call her sister the next day and to make that first phone call. And it kind of all clicked into place. It felt very serendipitous. And I needed to be very careful that I wasn't breaching her trust and taking advantage of that, as well as her sister's, because her sister's life was very much in danger at the time. But that's really how it happened. And kind of the flip side of making documentary films is you connect with your film protagonists, your participants, you build a friendship with them, you build trust with them, and then you bring the camera into the equation. We did everything opposite. And so now, we have a very good friendship, and she's traveled with this film, she's come to screenings, and we are close as individuals and as collaborators, but we always kind of reflect on how, this entire process happened backwards.
But it happened backwards in a good way, a delightful way, in bringing about this story. So I need you to fill in the gap for us, because it ended with Lacia indicated, I'm not leaving the house, even though she's sleeping in her clothes or has her backpack. But at the end, she did end up leaving. Can you fill us in on the missing pieces on why she did leave and how long after after that FaceTime call she did leave?
Yeah, so that FaceTime call was at the end of February. It was when the war had just started. And she was very intent on not leaving. She wasn't going to leave. She was going to stay in her country and see this through. And there's so much uncertainty at the time. And where the war is now as to where it was when it started, I think a lot of people thought things would go in a lot of different directions, and things have been quite surprising, I think, in the outcome of how Ukrainians have resisted the forces. But she was intent on staying. And her husband was serving on the front lines. She wasn't going to stay. She was going to wait for him. After we finished filming, I was obviously in touch with Lacia, and we were starting to build a friendship. And she was checking in on her sister periodically through that time. And sometime at the end of April, so about 2 months since that first phone call, we lost contact with them. We couldn't reach them for weeks and weeks. And they were in the process. They had just been in the process of trying to get her refugee status to come to the US, because if you have someone in the US, they can sponsor you. And we lost contact with them. And we were trying, Lacia was trying, her family was trying. And it was a horrible time because we feared the worst. But then a month later, we got word that they had made their way into a Polish refugee camp. And Poland is the bordering country. And they were able to finally transition into the US. And so that whole period of limbo was because they were transitioning between countries and they had fled the Ukraine. And it was simply because at the time things had gotten so dangerous in Odessa, where the family's from. And it came down to her fearing for her kids' lives. She was like, I have a 16-year-old and I have a 13-year-old. My pride for my country and my love for wanting to stand with my country can go so much. And the film talks about what the experience is for kids and how gruesome it is. Eventually she was just like, no, I mean, at the end of the day, my kids' lives are most important, and there was a real threat to their physical safety and well-being. And so that was when they made the decision to move, and it was very, very hard for them. But yeah. And then what you see at the end of the film and the credits is their reunion at the airport in the beginning of June of last year. So exactly a year ago, literally.
Okay, so when they reunited, after you film, well, okay, let's go back. After you filmed the FaceTime call, what was your intent of to what were you going to do with the film? Because you didn't know they were going to reunite. Did you let
Yeah.
it sit there? Tell us, take us through that process.
Yeah, I mean, the film was very much about this one moment. And for me, that was hard to do. I credit my producer so much with helping me stay on vision. After we finished that phone call and that first shoot, I had so many ideas of wanting to follow Lacia through her life in New York. And I was really curious about what it felt like for her to be safe and on the other side of conflict, but really fighting this internal conflict every day of guilt and worry and what that looked like, how that manifested in her day-to-day life. And she was very active in the Ukrainian community. She's a performer, an artist, and I documented so much of her activism and her art and her performances for charity, and all of that. And eventually it was the right call because the film needed to stay centered on this one moment between them. But it really, we could not have predicted the ending of the film and what you see in the credits. During that 1 month of limbo when we couldn't get in touch with her sister, I really worried about how it would feel to put this film out if something horrible had happened to them. It just would have been a completely different film, knowing with a bad outcome versus the outcome that is today. But you know, that's documentary, and that's the hardest thing about going into making a documentary in this way when things are so much unfolding. It's not a historical documentary, it's very much in the present, is you have to surrender to the truth of reality, whether you like it or not, and that is what the story will be.
So when did you decide? I guess the uh, Lacia's daughter was the one playing the clarinet in the piece.
I'm sorry?
Lacia's daughter was the one playing the clarinet. Yeah.
Yes.
When did you decide to use that as part of telling the story?
I was really interested in speaking with her because she was 16, 17. And I was really interested because I was always very interested in generational portraits of war. There's definitely, different experiences of war that different generations are going through, and especially a generation where we're also tapped into our phones and social media. This is a war that's happening very much in the present day where technology is very much a part of it, and that's influenced communication and how people have stayed in touch. So I remember, meeting her with her mom, and I always knew that I wanted her perspective to be in the film, sort of as a foil and as like a complement to her mother's perspective and her mother's kind of woe and feelings of entrapment. There's this kind of really raw, innocent guilt that Eva, as a 17-year-old, feels thinking about her friends and trying to stay in touch with them and recognizing, even though she's so young, that the only reason she's alive and safe is because she's in this country and that by pure happenstance. And it's a different perspective, but I liked marrying the two together.
Well, great. So another perspective you had was the band at the end. Can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that? How you obtained the footage and why you decided to use that?
Yeah, I mean, it was such a conversation between my producers, Lacey and her sister, and me. Um, I knew I wanted to end the film on something that was resonant to the spirit of Ukrainian people, and I didn't really know what that meant or looked like or sounded like at the time. I knew that we were going to end eventually when we found out that Yulia was safe on that note, and there was this uplifting, hopeful note to kind of say that, love gets us through, and this is the portrait of a family where they've been lucky. Love has gotten them through, and they're together after this harrowing time that we've all gone on this journey with them. That footage of this band playing in front of this really eerie scene of a deserted street, sandbags on the ground. It's the first few days of the war in, in Ukraine, and they're playing this really happy song. There's this really strange, like, disjunct to it, but it was so captivating to me. And I spoke to Lacey about it, and she watched it, and she was like, "This is it. This is Ukrainian. These are Ukrainian people. This is what Ukraine is. It's the spirit of this country that we will just fight till the end. We stand till the end." And I think that's even a line that her daughter says in the film. It's just like, "This is who we are. We don't leave. We stand until the end." And that theme had been coming up in the film a lot. And I thought it was so poetic to marry it with this really interesting scene of people just trying to make the best of a horrible situation, and how they were doing that.
Interesting. Yeah. So very interesting way to end it. And the song, like you said, is very eerie, but very powerful. In our last few moments, let the reunion, did you film that, or did someone else film it at the when Lacey and her sister met?
No, that was filmed by Eva, her daughter, who
Oh,
was in the film. So it
oh,
was a cool way of actually collaborating with your participants. I was not at the airport. It was so short notice, and I was also not in the country at the time. And I just asked them, I was like, "Can you please film this moment?" And I thought it would be really, really powerful to have that moment be filmed by them and just be their moment. The lens of how we're seeing that reunion isn't mine, this outsider filmmaker, it's theirs. And, it's shaky, it's with the phone, and I loved it. I loved that it was filmed that way. It was so kind of like spontaneous. I didn't prep them for it or anything. I was just like, "Oh my God, make sure you film it." And it was so beautiful. It was just so beautifully raw and happy, especially after you go through such a harrowing journey with them.
absolutely. And I like the way you did it because you told your story, and then at the end, you had them tell the story in their own words, with the credits and the titles and so forth. So that's great. So lastly, on the response to this film, I know it was on PBS's Point of View documentary shorts. What other kind of distribution have you had, and how has the response been?
The response has been incredible, honestly. I mean, I truly didn't make this film thinking about the response. I made it to document a moment, and I made it with my participants, for them, with them. And when we sold it to PBS, that happened very quickly after the film was made. So it was a beautiful surprise, and it was truly the best platform to be able to work with public broadcasting, um, because of this issue and how much the U.S. has participated in this war, and how much there with the refugee crisis, how many Ukrainians are making their way to the U.S. It makes a lot of sense for U.S. viewers to be able to engage with what people in this country are going through, and what Ukrainians in this country are going through. I've been able to create resources and educational guides with POV and PBS's support, to accompany the film, which probes audiences to think deeply about our relationship to home, our relationship to conflict and war and language, and all of these deeper things. The film has toured for a year now, literally exactly a year. We've screened across the country, and across the world, mainly in Europe. And we've done a few screenings in Asia. We had a screening in Japan and Taiwan and Hong Kong, actually, in a few days that I forgot to mention earlier, which none of us are obviously there for. But the very first place the film screened unofficially was Ukraine, and that was our intent from the start. It screened for a very small audience in Kyiv, back in May, so it was risky to put it together, and I was able to collaborate with partners there, and we screened it there for an audience, and that was a very interesting experience because they were watching a Ukrainian person in the diaspora react to the war while they themselves were experiencing the war. That was the first place that it screened. Recently, last month, I was in Italy, screening the film and promoting it, where we have gotten Italian distribution. And next, in a couple weeks, I think this is where we'll wrap the film up, is we'll screen in DC for our DC premiere at a film festival called DC Docs. And that will be the end, and it'll live on public TV for the next 4 years.
Wonderful, wonderful. So that's just great that this film has so many legs to it. Before I let you go, you're working on a piece now. Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so this is a very different piece, I think. It's also a short documentary, but longer. It's more broadcast length of 26 to 30 minutes. We are in post-production in that, and I'm working with a co-director, which has been a lovely experience. It's a film about a town that I lived in for 4 years before I moved to New York. I lived in a small town in upstate New York called Saratoga Springs. It's predominantly white, very wealthy, very conservative, and very reminiscent of the landscape of upstate New York. And I was living there, and I was living there through 2020, in the summer of 2020, and started documenting what the movement for Black Lives looked like in a small town in upstate New York, where a very similar police killing of a Black man had happened. That no one was talking about, and I didn't feel like, especially New York media, was speaking about and engaging with. And there were so many parallels with the time, and there was a very small movement of people that were very, very dedicated to trying to get word out. And so I went along with them, and I was helping them document the movement, and we started working on a documentary together. And that's felt very much more of a collaborative film. My co-director and I have been collaborating with the four activists who've been pushing for justice in this town. And it's been a process of 3 years now, literally. And it's beautiful, but we hope to be able to release very soon, which is very exciting. And that's going to look like a very different kind of distribution to this film, where it's going to be rooted in the community, and it's going to be rooted in conversations, especially in small towns in upstate New York and throughout the country, on the parallels with the political systems in these small towns, the communities, this small in-group thinking, and how, what has changed, what has not changed. It's been 3 years, and it doesn't feel like we've made the strides that we should have.
I wish you all the best with that.
Thank you so much.
Sanjna Selva, director of Call Me Anytime, I'm Not Leaving the House. Thank you so much for joining us and for providing us with this really great film.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for joining us for this important and invigorating conversation. For more information about upcoming film festivals, please visit us at clevelandfilm.org. I'm Eric Siler. Thank you.
Thank you.